Hi, I hope that you all are doing well and keeping safe. My name is Randy Ramphal. I'm a licensed social worker, and the topic that I want to discuss tonight is grief. The reason for discussing grief is because 2020 has been a very difficult year where many people have lost loved ones, and I know that it is the holiday season where there are a lot of family get-togethers that usually happens, and it is a time when people tend to miss the ones that they lost during this period. So it's a very difficult time. So I figured that, one of the things to do is to kind of discuss what grief is, the process of grief, and how we can help each other through the process, whether it be that we are grieving or that we know someone that's grieving, ways of how we can help each other and ourselves. So I'm gonna start off by saying when I think of grief, the thoughts that come to mind is feeling of sadness, being heartbroken, feeling overwhelmed, thinking about losing someone, fear. There are a lot of things that come to mind when I think about grief. But to start off this actual video, I wanted to provide a definition of grief that came from a clinical review done by Catherine Stadt, who's an MD, and Stanley Zook, who's also a medical doctor. And what they said that grief is that grief is a sense of emotional, cognitive, functional, and behavioral responses to death or other kinds of loss. It is a series, right? They said it is not a state, but it is a process. So they talk about, grief being a process. It is not just a mental state, but it is a process. And within these processes, you have different stages and different steps of grief. So there are many theories, right? Theories that speak about grief. For instance, you had Freud, right? And Freud believed that grief is an individual process where that involves withdrawing from a community and focusing on detaching yourself from a loved one, right? So that's just Freud theory. But then you also have the one that is widely used, like in clinical setting, of grief. This one comes from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who defined the stages of grief as DABDA. That's DABDA. And what that stands for, the first stage is denial. So in the phase of denial, we lose someone, but like we're still in a shock. Like we're still thinking like, wow, this did not happen. So we're in this denial phase, right? We can't seem to accept what is happening. After you go through the first phase, there is the second phase called you have depression, then you have anger. So there is anger. So someone, you lost one of your loved ones, or let's say a job or a relationship or something like that, right? Then there is anger. So first there's the denial, and then comes the anger, where you have the emotion of anger. You're upset at why things happen. You question why things happen. Why are they happening the way that it is? So there is anger. The third step is bargaining, and this is usually like, let's say the bargaining phase. When I think about it, I think about like, for people who are terminally ill, right? You get diagnosed with the illness, and then you start bargaining with God, like, hey, or like a divine partner, if you take away this illness from this person, or if you save this person, then I might change my life, I might convert, I might do something with my life. So this is where you start bargaining, right? Then after the bargaining phase, it comes the depression, where you go through the phase of denial, you go through a phase of anger, then you go through the phase of bargaining, and then kind of like reality kind of sets in, where you start feeling depressed, you start feeling hopeless, loss of interest in the things that you once did, you start feeling sad, so you're feeling depressed about losing that person, or losing the relationship, losing the job, and so forth. And so after depression comes acceptance, right? And acceptance is the place where, okay, well, you know what, this person, you lose this person, you lose the relationship, you lose the job, you come to that place of acceptance. And when you start accepting it is when you are at peace, you're ready to move on, you're ready to do things differently. Now, there are these 5 stages again, with like depression, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance, right? But these phases technically it goes different from individual to individual, right? Like no same individual encounter grief the same way. It goes differently. So somebody might not go through all the different phases, but this is just kind of like a breakdown of the phases that they can go through during the grief process. And one of the things that we want to take into consideration is the cultural differences of people who encounter grief. So like some cultures, right, like they might express their grief more verbally, or they might be more expressive about it. But then you have other cultures that are more quiet, or like they're less expressive about the grief, right? They deal with it kind of like on their own. And then you also have to think about the religious aspect, where like, you have a lot of people who might belong to religious organizations that might say, you know what, well, losing someone might be God's will, and then they might try to gain their strength from that, right? Where you might have others who might not believe in a specific religion and might deal with it differently. So you just want to make sure that when somebody goes through these phases of grief, that we take into consideration that the cultural and your religious background and the beliefs when going through grief. So that's the process of grief, right? So we talked about the definition of grief, we talked about the process of grief. Now we're going to talk about different types of grief, right? So, and I kind of feel like this is very important, because like when we talk about grief, it's such like a broad topic. It's something that is, it's a broad topic that it's not sometimes broken down. So I'm going to speak about like the main ones that come along, and I just want to shed a little light on that. So one type of grief is called anticipatory mourning, and that's a type of grief when before someone dies, or before you lost a relationship or something, you already start grieving. So when I think about this, an example would be someone who is terminally ill, and let's say we're given a certain amount of months or days by a doctor to live before they transition. So even before the passing, the family, the friends would start grieving in the process, and that's what you call anticipatory grief. Then you have something that is called a normal grief, and a normal grief is basically just experiencing a wide range of emotions. You lose someone, you lose a job, you lose a relationship, you lose a loved one. This is where you experience a lot of different emotions. So some days you might feel sad, other days you feel depressed, and you feel angry, you feel overwhelmed, you feel hopeless, like, so you feel all these different emotions, right? But you can't pinpoint which days you would feel what, right? Then you have something that is called complicated grief. And complicated grief happens to be something where people experience more severe like emotions and behaviors, and the ability to function is less than what they would usually function, right? And this kind of grief, people would maybe feel more angry. They might feel numb. They might feel unable to accept the loss. And then what they might do, they might even go to the extent of feeling like they want to be with the person that they lost, or the person who deceased. So complicated grief is more severe, and in order for it to be considered complicated grief, it has to be more than 6 months. So grieving for more than 6 months, that could turn into complicated grief. Then you have something called chronic grief, and chronic grief is where this person is still in the denial phase, where they cannot come to the place of accepting what that grief is. And it's kind of like you blocking out, like, this really happened, like this person is really gone, I really lose this person. And then you come to that place where you can't accept it, and you keep like the memories of the person, everything you attribute to that person. Time goes by, and then you keep being in pain, because at this time you haven't come to that place of acceptance. And that's chronic grief is usually grief for at least like a year or so forth. Then you have something that is called the cumulative grief, right? So cumulative grief would be something where you have numerous losses at the same time. So for instance, like myself, I lost two people that were very close to me within the space of 2 months, or like 1 month, right? That would be considered cumulative grief, because while I was grieving for one person, another person came and then passed on. So you start grieving for the second person, and then you block out the grief from the first person, because again, you focus on the second person. So that is what you call complicated grief. Then you have something that I wanted to mention, right? I mean, there are other forms of grief, but these are like the main ones. The other one that I wanted to mention, it is called absent grief. And absent grief is when a person cannot come to terms to acknowledge that, you know what, this person has moved on, or this relationship has ended, or I have lost this job. So it's kind of like it's similar, and it's close to to a different type of grief, right? The one that I just mentioned. So this type of grief is more you stuck in like the denial phase, right? That's what you call the absent grief. And then of course there is something called secondary loss. And what secondary loss is, it is more, you lose someone, right? You lose someone, you're grieving, you lose this person. You like let's say a couple, one other person transitions, right? Then the person who remains in the relationship lose their role as a wife. They lose their role, like let's say if they were dependent on that person financially, that's a secondary loss. So all these are forms of grief that people encounter. And I think that it is good if we can actually identify which grief we are actually experiencing at this time, right? So we do have different forms of grief. So we talked about the different forms of grief. We talked about the definition of grief. We talked about the process of grief. We even talked about, two theories of grief, right? And now we could talk about what we can do what we can do to help someone who's grieving. So if you know someone who is experiencing grief, these are some things that we can do. So what we want to do, we want to be able to be a good listener. We want to be able to sit down with someone, and we want to be able to listen to them. Sometimes when people are experiencing grief, it is very, very, very difficult for them to listen to somebody keep talking to them and telling them what to do, what they shouldn't do. And what they just want is for someone to listen. They just need a shoulder to lean on. So be that person who is an active listener and who would be there for them. You also do not want to minimize someone's grief. So, for instance, if someone loses a loved one, they might have a different relationship compared to their brother, their sister, their cousin. They might have a different relationship. So, therefore, their grief might be stronger. They might experience more grief. So you don't want to minimize somebody's grief, and you want them to be able to express that grief to you without shutting them down. Another way that you can help someone who's grieving is to acknowledge their pain. Because most of the times when people are grieving, one of the things that they would always say is that you don't know what I'm going through. You would never understand what I'm going through. Yes, we may not understand what you're feeling right now, but it is good to try to put yourself in their position, in their shoes, right? Try to empathize with them and acknowledge these feelings, acknowledge their pain. And again, you do not want to not validate the pain that they're going through. You want to be able to be available for these individuals who are grieving, be available for them. When I say available, I mean, if they call you and you are available, answer the phone. Be available for them for whatever they may need, right? Sometimes when people grieve, a lot of times they might want to be by themselves. They might want to be, not be outside, right? So if they need you, you just want to be able to be there for them. You want to be able to extend yourself more, because grief is not an easy thing. So now I know you're probably thinking, well, you're talking about grief, but how can you differentiate depression and grief? The way how you could differentiate depression and grief, so depression could be part of grief, right? But with depression, there is like a constant feeling of hopelessness and despair. However, with grief, you have moments of despair, moments of despair and feeling hopeless, but you can also have moments of feeling, happy, finding pleasure in something. But you would also have your moments, right? So kind of like depression is more constant, but with grief, there are changes in the different emotions. So I spoke about what we can do for someone, right? Like, as I said, be a good listener, don't minimize their grief, acknowledge the pain, ask about the loss, be willing to be open to speak about it, don't shut people down, be available when when you can, and assist them, to in whatever that you can, right? Whether it be helping them with tasks, whatever that may be. Now, if you are coping with grief, these are some things that you can do for yourself if you are coping with grief. So again, one of the things that you want to make sure you do is to acknowledge your feelings. So you don't want to put judgment on the way that you feel. You don't want to say, oh, I shouldn't feel this way. I don't know why I'm feeling this way. It is okay to feel the way that you're feeling. One of the first steps in the process of grief, in working through grief, is to acknowledge the feelings that, you know what, I am hurting. This is how I feel. And to be present with those feelings, to be able to sit with those feelings. Now, it would not be easy, but acknowledge the feelings is a good way to start without placing any judgment on those feelings. Another thing that you can do is to speak to family and friends. This is a time when the more support you have might be beneficial for you to help you through the process of grief, right? It's going to be very difficult grieving alone and going through grief alone. So speak to family and friends, about the grief. Be able to take up the phone and, give family and friends a call. Another thing that you can do is speak to a therapist if you feel the need. So for instance, like with complicated grief, when you have excessive feelings of sadness and hopelessness and so forth, it is good if you can reach out to a therapist, a licensed professional, right? They would be able to walk you through the process of grief from step to step, right? And they would be able to help you with that. So if you feel that you're grieving and you want to talk to someone, call up a therapist. There's no shame in speaking to a therapist about any of this. Also, you want to make sure another thing that you can do is join support groups. There are many support groups where people who experience loss and are grieving come together and they share their stories and how they cope with it. And just by listening to someone's stories or learning from them, like what they did to overcome grief, that can actually help you. And you can actually help someone too by sharing your story, or by even teaching them about the skills that you use to overcome grief. So, a supportive, joining a support group. I want to say also to be patient with yourself. Be very patient with yourself. Allow yourself time to grieve. Don't try not to put a time frame of like, it's been 3 months, I should be done with grieving. No, be patient with yourself, because the thing is, when with grief, sometimes it could seem like we're not making progress with grief. It could seem like we're not really making any progress. When I think about grief, I think about just going in circles, where you feel like you're not going anywhere. But every morning that you wake up, and every morning that you get out of bed and you decide to do something, right? That is progress in itself. So don't downplay the progress that you're making. Even if you feel like you're not making any progress, you are making progress. So be patient with yourself. Also, you want to do things that you like, that would make you feel good, that would make you feel better, whether it be a hobby, whether it be reading a book, whether it be whatever hobby that you like, or something that makes you feel good. I will say, to continue to do something every day that makes you feel good. Then another thing I would like to add is also spirituality. So as I was mentioning earlier, a lot of people use self-help books. They use religious books. This is a time when they dig deep for their faith, where they gain a lot of their strength from. But on the flip side, you have people who, when they're going through grief, they do not want to be associated with religion or a higher power or a divine because they feel hopeless, or maybe that, they're still upset at losing someone. So again, if tapping into spirituality can be great, and you can do that in many ways, whether it be, praying to, whoever you pray to, or it can be even doing spiritual exercises like yoga, reading is good, like self-help books and so forth. That can also be beneficial. One thing that I do want to point out too is that when there is grief, and for someone who works within the substance use population, right? There might be people who may have had substance use history, who may have been sober for some time, and because of grief and with the pain that they're encountering, sometimes they can also relapse. So you want to be able to, for those who may have, like a substance use history, if they have that urge, you want to see if you can reach out to one of the groups that maybe you were at. So for instance, like Alcohol Anonymous, like AA or NA, one of those places, right, that you can reach out to for the extra help. You can also call, in New York City, there's New York Well. Like if you're grieving and you're feeling hurt, you can call New York Well, and they would be able to help you, through this process. Or you can even call, for people with substance use who feel like there could be like a relapse, you can also call the substance use hotline. Again, this is the presentation on grief. If you are grieving right now, just know that you are loved, that this will become easy as the process goes on. It will become easier. You are loved, and continue to press on each and every day. All right. If this video helped you, feel free to share, to like, and to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you. Have a good night. Bye.